Well, hello TPC, we're glad to have you tonight. Thank you for joining us in our life groups. We're going to continue our lessons on stories of the lesser known. So we're going to open up with an icebreaker question, and here it is. Have you ever had a first impression of someone that proved to be wrong? Take just a minute and let's open up with that question. This is the story of Ittai, and to tell his story, we must also tell the story of David and how that it affected his choices down the road. Ittai was there the day that David defeated Goliath, and all he could do was just stand there and witness this astonishing event that his eyes showed him, but his mind just simply could not believe. If Ittai survives the day, he knows that this will be something that he'll never forget for as long as he lives. The slaying of a giant is no easy thing to erase. Harder still would be forgetting this young boy's face who had done the slaying, and it would forever be embedded in his memory. Now, this is not the story of David and Goliath. This is the story of Ittai, a Philistine soldier who receives just a few verses in the Bible. It's also a story of really two men. One is an Israelite and one is a Philistine. One is a warrior and one is a shepherd. They have nothing in common other than God had a plan for both of them. So I want to talk about choices, and specifically about information we use to make choices. We've all seen men and women like David in the height of their power, seemingly invincible, on top of the world, as we say. They have it all. They have the looks, they have the talent, they have the blessing, they have the opportunity that we wished we had. And in comparing ourselves to them, inevitably, we come up short, and it leaves us feeling small and inadequate. We don't take into account what we don't see. The countless hours that they spend honing their chosen craft. We can never underestimate the battles that they wage against self-doubt and the rejection at the hand of others, the frustration they endure on the way here. No, we only see their mountaintop experience, only witness the slaying of giants, and we find ourselves wishing that we could be like them. I wish I had his life or her talent. If only I could be more like them. And herein lies the folly of such thoughts. We do not fully comprehend what we're asking for. Because if we did, we would never ask for their lives. Because we are asking for their successes, but we're not seeing their failures. We want their highs only because we haven't witnessed their lows. We don't know about the unbelief that they've endured on every corner. We have no clue about the smallness of their beginnings. We see their triumphs, but we've not seen their tests. No, if we could see them shoveling sheep dung in the wilderness, we might reconsider. There's a saying that says, never meet your heroes. Do you know why that is? Because they'll never turn out and reach the heights that you imagine them to be. You might have a fanciful tale about their lives being based upon the highs, but most of the time they're never able to live up to it. So here's the question, and that is, have you ever been guilty of drawing conclusions about someone based upon their highs or success, only to find out they were just as human as we are, flaws and all? A time where you credited someone's success on them, quote, having it all together, or, quote, being blessed, without taking into account the trials that they've endured and the hard work that they've put in. So take just a minute and let's answer these questions. Now, this is part 2 of the story, and it's really about the madman. Because Ittai, he is a captain over 100, and he was present along with his peers. They were silently lining the interior walls of the hall where all major decisions were made in the Philistine city of Gath. And they're all there. And now, for a second time in his life, Ittai couldn't believe what his eyes were telling him. the man wreathing on the floor like a madman, jabbering unintelligently, spittle running down his dark beard, the dust of the road covering his once fine garments, and a massive sword was laid out in front of him. A sword that Ittai knew, and he knew it very well. And without the sword to mark him, most men probably would have failed to recognize this man. But Ittai had known instantly. Neither age nor dirt was enough to disguise the face of the man who, against all odds, had defeated what was undefeatable and single-handedly put the armies of Philistia to flight. He would never forget that face. Now, how had this come to be? How had this remarkable man fallen upon such a state? The man who had slain the giant, who had slain 200 Philistine warriors at the whim of their king, who had routed all of his enemies with success and ease. How was he now in this particular place? It was impossible for Ittai to reconcile the man who had performed all of these feats with the madman that he now saw before him. How could a man rise to such heights and to be brought down to such lows? Now, for the sake of time, I've offered here an abbreviated telling of David's first encounter among the Philistines. This is through the eyes of Ittai. We know how David left his flight from the murderous King Saul and had come to Gath seeking safety. But whatever his plan had been and had brought him there, it quickly dissolved upon his arrival there. Succumbing to unbelief and fear, he feigned madness in an attempt to make them send him away. Ittai's feeling most likely reflect our own, and he raised the question that I'm sure we're raising and we ask ourselves, and that is this: how could this happen? What was he thinking? Where was the David that he had come to know so well? This man of faith, this man of courage, a man of such power with God. And to use David's own words, oh, how the mighty have fallen. We too have seen the mighty fallen, and as surely as we make heroes out of people who are on top of the world, so do we make villains out of the ones who have fallen in the valleys. The same caution on making these rash decisions apply here as well. We need to be careful about drawing conclusions about people based on the low points in their lives, because we all make mistakes and we all fall short. And we also pray that we're not judged by these fallings, that the rest of our lives are not tainted by the failures of our past. If Ittai had made the decision about David based on the madman that he saw that day, it would have dire consequences for both of them in the future. However, we also find ourselves guilty of judging someone based on their mistakes instead of taking in their life as a whole, only to find ourselves surprised by what greatness lies within. How many times have we met someone in a low point of their life and our impression of them moving forward has forever been jaded by that initial impression? It's human. We all do it, but we must be careful. Writing someone off in their failure can mean that we miss out on the greatness that they are destined for. A destiny you could be a part of if only you would have given them a chance to change your mind. So here is the question. Have you ever been judged by mistakes in your past that you couldn't seem to shake? And how does that make you feel? Does it make you more sympathetic toward others and their failures? Take a minute and let's answer that question. Now here's part 3 of the story, and it's basically the choice. Because David is now fleeing Jerusalem. Israel's in rebellion. They are following after David's own son Absalom. And in a preventive action, David has gathered those who are closest to him, who are loyal. And he is evacuating, hoping to avoid battle in the streets of his beloved city, Jerusalem. And so David stops at a place fittingly called the last house. And this is where he sees him. A face he hasn't seen in ages and probably thought he'd never see again. He stood out very plainly, and he was just different from the rest. There was a different build, a different coloring, a different bearing. This guy wasn't an Israelite. He was a Philistine. A Philistine. Here and now, David probably thought, when all of the world is crashing in around him and his own son Absalom has turned against him and he's getting all of those who are loyal to him and trying to evacuate him out of the city. And now he sees this Philistine. But upon further recognition, he realizes that it was Ittai, the Gittite. And David stops and he pulls him aside. And he must have really kind of struggled with what to say, because no doubt he was dumbfounded and surprised. And finally he chokes out the words he didn't want to say, but he has to say them. And he looks and he says, "Return to the king." He's speaking of Absalom and not himself. He said, "You've just arrived here, so don't cast your lots with me. Go offer your services to the new king and leave me to my fate." David must have realized that Ittai, as a foreigner and someone not involved or invested in this power struggle, would have been much better off establishing himself in Israel if he sided with Absalom. So David said, "Whatever you do, Ittai, don't waste your future on me." And that was sound advice, probably the kind that most men would have taken, and why not? This war wasn't Ittai's to fight. And yet the words of the Philistine, let me say that again, right there. This war wasn't Ittai's to fight. And yet the words Philistine said in reply to David are some of the most beautiful in Scripture. And this is what Ittai said to David: "As the Lord liveth, and as my king liveth, surely in what place my Lord the king shall be, whether in death or in life, even there also will thy servant be." Those are just outstanding words of loyalty. There's great words of dedication from a man whose people were sworn enemies with his own. From a man who once stood across the battlefield from him. From a man who once saw David slay Goliath. And now Ittai was presented with a choice, and he made his. And now let's make some sense of the previous two stories. Ittai was one of the chosen few who had the opportunity to see David at arguably his highest point in his life and his lowest point in his life. He had witnessed the standing victory upon the back of the headless corpse of a giant and seen him drooling on the floor like a madman. So knowing this, what was it that made the decision for Ittai? He had seen the highs, he had seen the lows, but he had seen something else as well. What he had seen lay in between the highs and the lows, because David had come to Philistia and lived among them for 18 months. And somewhere within those 18 months, Ittai had come to know a David who he saw what was truly in his heart. And David had made such an impression upon him that it was more powerful than the mountains and more convincing than the valleys. Ittai had spent enough time with him to come to understand that David could not always be the boy who slayed the giants. And there was so much more to the man who played mad. There was more than the sum of David's victories and of his defeats. So what did David do to earn this incredible amount of respect and loyalty? Well, the Bible doesn't share that with us. But whatever it was, whatever he did, it caused Ittai, along with the men who served under him, to come to David's aid when he needed it the most. When David made his last stand against Absalom and his superior forces, he devised a plan of attack in the cover of the dense forest with 3 separate companies of men. One was led by the military genius Joab, and that was a nephew to David. And one was led by Abishai, Joab's brother, and listed among the mighty men of the Bible. And the last company, yes, you guessed it, it was Ittai the Philistine. And when it was all over that day, and David was once again king, and Absalom was dead, and the forces opposed to David were scattered, one can't help but wonder if this would have even been possible without the last-minute efforts of Ittai. One thing I failed to mention is that Ittai is described as being in exile when it comes to David, as in banishment from his land and from his people. Now, the scriptures do not tell us this information, so we don't know all the reasoning behind it, but I have an idea. And I'd like to believe that it was all about David. That after spending 18 months around him, Ittai found he had lost his taste for what he had been living around. It made him no longer satisfied to live the life he had once lived, no longer wish to serve the gods that he had once served. That living around David had awakened something within him, that it created a hunger for something greater, a thirst for what David possessed. So here's something that we ask ourselves: is our everyday life one that makes our enemies respect us and even want to follow us? Does how we conduct ourselves in the in-between, in other words, in between the highs and the lows, convince those around us that our God should be their God? And do we treat those above us with respect and those under us with kindness? What does our idle words say about our character? What impressions are we making? Who are you when you are among, say, the Philistines or the world? Who are you then? Be careful, because someone is watching. Someone is watching you. Someone is watching us. And they may be making a decision about who you are and your character and your God that will not only affect their destiny, but yours as well. So here's the question. Speak about a time when someone made a lasting impression on you in the way they simply live their everyday, day-to-day life. Who made a lasting difference in your life by doing something that seemed small at the time, but had great implications for your future? Take a minute, let's discuss that question.